He was 20 minutes late for the meeting that could decide the next round of funding. His shoes hit the hot asphalt like clock hands. His phone vibrated in his jacket, an urgent thread of messages, a calendar alert that pulsed red. Ricardo kept his face calm in the reflection of the glass facade as he walked, precise, planned, implacable. He had rehearsed the pitch on the drive-in. He had rehearsed the interruptions, too. He had rehearsed being brief. Then a small hand, calloused, quick, pulled at the hem of his tailored coat. Ricardo looked down. At the curb, in the crude shadow of a parked SUV, a boy no older than 9 or 10 was digging through a plastic bag beside a row of overflowing trash bins. The boy had one leg. The other stump was covered by a frayed sock and a faded bandage. His balance was fierce, learned. Dust clung to his hair. His clothes were patched in places where mending had once been an act of saving, not of choice. "Sir," the boy said. His voice was steady enough to surprise Ricardo, who was used to wealth talking back to him in smooth sentences and phone tones. "Look under your car." Ricardo frowned. He bent down, habit and curiosity at war. He could see, tucked against the tire, a small piece of paper wrapped like a secret. When he picked it up, the smell rose. Oil, the tang of frying, the familiar, honest comfort of bread and spice. It was a small fried pastry, still warm, pressed into a napkin someone had torn from a fast food bag. In Ricardo City, the pastry would be sold as a snack on a corner cart, a little ball of dough stuffed with spiced meat, greasy and satisfying. In another life, he would have called it by a different name, wrapped it in a napkin and handed it to a paying customer. Now it sat in his hand, more intimate than any contract. The boy watched him with clear eyes. One knee punched the ground. A makeshift crutch leaned against the SUV like a loyal sentinel. "I hid it," the boy said. "There are older kids. They take things if they see. I didn't want to lose it." He reached out and blinked as if embarrassed. "You can have half. I already ate at the church this morning." Ricardo's watch blinked at him again, a small indifferent LED. He thought of the elevator pitch, of graphs, of the boardroom's bright lights. He thought of the apartment he paid a fortune to keep tidy and empty. He thought of the daughter who lived 2 states away and called on holidays. He thought of time, that elastic thing he never had enough of. Instead of giving the pastry back, the boy nudged it toward him with the side of a dirty finger. The offer was not a plea. It was a small, disarming lesson. "Take it," he said. "You look like you need it." For half a second, Ricardo felt ridiculous. Then something in the heat and the smell, an ordinary human affection, stopped him. He sat on the curb. The action felt ridiculous, too. A man of his stature sitting on a curb beside a trash bin, losing minutes he could not afford. A clerk in a distant cafe might have taken his seat. A rival might have used his absence. But he sat. They split the pastry unevenly, as if fairness were an embarrassment. The boy tore his half with his thumb and ate with a slowness that suggested gratitude as religion. Ricardo chewed a corner and tasted flour, fat, and a home he could not remember. They did not exchange the kind of words men of Ricardo's world passed for courtesy. There were no questions about his story, no interrogations. The boy said his name was Mateo. Mateo's accent folded around the syllables like a familiar song. He had been sleeping under the viaduct with his grandmother, he said. Her name was Rosa, and she cooked for anyone who would trade a story for a spoonful. He told Ricardo matter-of-factly about older kids who chased him for the little he could carry, about the day a car pinched his foot and left him with one less limb to trust. He said these things as if they were part of a long list. They did not demand pity. He was small but steady. The morning light, the heat, the city's hum made a kind of music around him. When he laughed, dirt sprayed like confetti. Ricardo asked a question he did not expect to ask. "Why did you point under my car?" Mateo cocked his head. "It was safe there," he said. "I didn't want anyone to take it. I hid it. But I didn't want it to be wasted. You almost hit me when you parked. I thought maybe if you saw it, you wouldn't drive away. Then you would know I'm here." Ricardo looked at the pastry again and then at the boy's stump. The boy's trousers were patched where a prosthetic might have been, and in the quiet pocket beneath his shirt, he kept a little bundle of crumpled paper. Drawings, perhaps, lines that suggested a world he held tight. There was no self-pity in his posture, only the precise economy of someone who had learned to ask for the right things. When the pastry was gone, Ricardo stood. He felt the day shift under him like a plank moved in a ship. He told Mateo he was late and should leave. He told himself the meeting, the investors, the projection models were essential.
Mateo shrugged as if he had known all along that adults would say such things. "You can come tomorrow," he said. "There is soup at the church at noon. You can sit with us." Something in Ricardo, something like a hinge loosening, made him say, without thinking, "I will come." He did not make a big show of it. He put the paper napkin into his pocket like an old talisman. The meeting later blurred into numbers and polite smiles. He spoke as if it were rehearsed, and his voice did not crack. In his head, the pastry reconstituted itself into a small scandal of conscience. How quickly he could have driven away. How small decisions sat in the chest for weeks, making the heart heavy or sharp. That night he could not sleep. His apartment, which he liked because it looked exactly like success, felt empty in the way of rooms that had been perfected around absence.
The curtains were the color of his meeting slides. The refrigerator hummed. He turned his watch to face the wall and tried to think like a venture capitalist. Metrics, probabilities, exit strategies. Instead, he thought of Mateo's hand reaching for the pastry and the dirt under his fingernails. He thought of Rosa bending over a small pot of soup. He thought of a child who offered half of what he had. The next morning, Ricardo did not go straight to the office. He bought more than pastries. He bought blankets rolled like promises, a stack of thick socks, a small pair of shoes in a size that might fit Mateo if luck favored him. He bought a cheap book of colored pencils he remembered from childhood, the kind that came with a cardboard sharpener. He wrapped the items without announcing them to the world. The act of carrying them made him feel like a man smuggling good intentions. When he got back to the viaduct, Mateo was where he had been, beside the Benz, beside the SUV, beside the little patch of city that had become his. The boy's crutch leaned against the same tire. His hair had been combed the wrong way, the way children comb their hair when they are trying to look grown. Rosa was inside a fold of tarpaulin, an older woman with quick hands and a face that had learned to keep warm by working. She had a pot simmering on a small stove made from salvaged metal. The smell of stewed beans rose like an offering. Rosa watched Ricardo approach with suspicion folded into welcome. She did not need strangers to solve her life. She had survived worse deals than the ones men like Ricardo proposed. Her arms, when she pushed a stray lock of hair back, had the thick muscles of someone who cooked for many years. Her apron bore grease like a map of where she'd been. "This is Mateo," Ricardo said, awkward as a man who had stepped out of a life he had rehearsed. "I brought some things." Rosa's eyes did not change. She folded them around the blankets with the economy of a woman who knew that goods must be useful or not at all. "We don't beg," she said. Her voice had the sternness of someone who had raised a child in a place that required boundaries. "We work for our food." Mateo smiled quick then, like a switch. "She's the best cook in the city," he said, proud as if nicknames had weight. "She makes beans nobody else can." Rosa huffed a laugh that was almost a cough. She eyed Ricardo again. "You are the businessman, yes? You came because you felt pity and wanted to feel good? We have had many like you." Ricardo opened his mouth and found himself surprised by his own words. "No," he said. "I came because you offered me something." He hesitated. "Because Mateo gave me half of his snack." The sentence sounded ridiculous in the open air, like a confession made over a saucepan. Rosa stared at him, then at her grandson. Mateo looked away, a little embarrassed to have caused the strange turn in a man's life. They sat, and Rosa ladled soup into 3 mismatched bowls. The heat from the pot steamed like a small benediction. Ricardo tasted it and found it ordinary and sharp and better than many meals he had paid for in sterile dining rooms. There were onions and paprika and a tenderness to it that could not be bought. They ate without discussing systems or NGOs. They ate like people who had not been taught how to make a small human connection feel safe. Ricardo returned on a slow rhythm after that. He did not announce his schedule. He came with additional blankets, a small box of playthings from Mateo, a textbook with large, bold letters about animals in distant places. He listened to Rosa's stories about recipes he had learned from her mother and how she stretched a pot to feed more mouths. He watched Mateo practice balancing, placing pebbles in a line to learn how far he could hop with his one leg and his stiff, patched sock. The neighborhood took note. It was hard to stay private when one man repeatedly crossed a public street carrying goods. Other children peered. some with suspicion, some with a hope that could make a smile brittle. A woman who ran a sleeping mat stall offered a repaired crutch one afternoon. A teenager tossed Matteo a small soccer ball he could kick with the stump of his leg. The city, in its small ways, rearranged itself around the pattern of a man who was not used to staying. Inside Ricardo, the change was less theatrical. He still answered emails with the same clinical efficiency. He still closed deals. He still told himself stories about the rightness of progress. But he slept differently. His phone now sometimes lit up in the middle of the night with a message from a number he had saved under Matteo. The messages were short. A drawing, a picture of a bird Matteo had drawn with the colors Ricardo had bought, a photo of Rosa stirring a pot. They were the kinds of things that accumulate into a seam of conscience. Not everyone was pleased by the seam. In the office, whispers traveled faster than the market's fluctuations. Marcelo, Ricardo's partner, and a man whose smile was the shape of a spreadsheet, found out when he saw Ricardo in the corridor carrying a box marked donations in plain black marker, an action that in Marcelo's mind endangered the company's focus. "You can't do this, Rico," Marcelo said, blunt and practiced. "We have a responsibility to investors. Personal projects derail careers. If you want to give, write a check to a foundation that will do it right. Don't start playing savior. That's not scalable." Ricardo felt the words like rain on a thin coat. Marcelo's objections were not cruel, they were pragmatic. He read the room with the same clarity that made him a good partner. "It's not about scale," Ricardo said, annoyed at his own defensiveness. "It's a human connection." Marcelo's face softened in a way that made Ricardo uncomfortable. "I get it," he said, "but think about optics."
Think about precedents. We can't house people in our offices. We can't pick and choose. You want to help? Fine, but we have to be systematic. Otherwise, this becomes a distraction. Ricardo wanted to say that the woman with the pot of soup did not need systems to know how to stretch a meal. He wanted to say that some things were not a line item. He wanted to ask Marcelo whether he had ever shared half a pastry with a child under a car and found it changed the way he ate breakfast forever. Instead, he felt the conversation as a muscle he had not warmed up. He had to keep the company alive. He had to be responsible. But the meeting that morning and the look in Matteo's eyes at the curb had conspired towards something more personal. Back at the viaduct, life kept its steady rhythm. Rosa continued to cook. She accepted Ricardo's gifts with a suspicious, weary grace. She did not ask him for money. She asked him once, in a way that was less a request than a compass, to teach Matteo to read. He should know letters, she said. He should know the world of words, even if he only sees it in pictures. Ricardo nodded and promised. Then he spent 3 evenings on the edge of his apartment floor watching videos about basic literacy techniques for children. He drew up a plan, a ridiculous thing for a man who usually drew up spreadsheets for product launches, about how to enroll Matteo in a nearby public school, about how the company might sponsor a tutoring hour. He thought of forms and permissions, of the paper trail that would preserve dignity and prevent deception. He imagined Rosa handing him a list of struggles like a ledger. He felt simultaneously like a man building a bridge and like a child with a flashlight trying to find his way under a storm drain. The first real obstacle was mundane and bureaucratic. The school required a birth certificate. Matteo had an informal name and a story that told of hospitals that had not recorded everything. Rosa had a piece of paper that served as proof of some things, but not of everything the hatch of an institution demanded. Ricardo went to the municipal office and discovered the odd coldness of places where forms outlived faces. He filled out applications, waited in lines that smelled of coffee and stale pins, and learned the art of asking people to do small favors. Each person he encountered offered the world a different tone of humanity. A clerk who stamped with indifferent precision, a teacher who leaned over a paper and read Matteo's drawing as if it mattered, a janitor who repaired a torn backpack strap with ghosted patience. As he navigated the city's small walls, Ricardo felt a tenderness that shook him at improbable hours, standing in a queue, listening to someone laugh over the price of bread. He had climbed high enough in the world to know its vocabulary of success. He had not known its softer grammar, the way hands could ask without speaking.
The more he listened, the more he felt the story become less about his role as benefactor and more about his role as witness. Witness to a child's inventiveness, to a grandmother's dignity, to the small economy of care that existed in alleys and under viaducts. One afternoon, after weeks of bringing blankets and books and coordinating paperwork, Ricardo found Matteo sitting on a low wall, his crutch propped at an angle, his drawing spread like a scattered deck of cards. The boy had drawn a house with a crooked chimney, a woman stirring a pot,
a small figure jumping in a circle. The drawings were a map of the life he lived and the life he wanted. "I can't take you to school unless we get the papers," Ricardo said gently, "but I can help with reading, if you want." Mateo did not answer immediately. He had the look of a child deciding whether to trust a bridge built of promises. Then he nodded. "Teach me words," he said, "and bring more of those colors. Red is my favorite." Ricardo laughed, and the sound felt like a small rupture, unexpected, welcome. "Red," he echoed. "Red will be everywhere." It was in those quiet lessons that Ricardo began to understand how foolish a single meeting's urgency could be. The important meetings, those that reshaped him, were not the ones with investors and PowerPoint. They were the ones with crayons and soup, and a boy who coaxed laughter out of someone who had learned to measure life by the size of his returns. But not everything softened. Rosa watched the progress with a steady eyebrow. She did not want charity in the form of appearances or glossy photographs. She wanted steady work, a way for Mateo to be seen as whole, and for her to keep her dignity. She allowed Ricardo's presence on a cautious hinge, one that made him feel both guilty and brave. When Marcelo's caution grew louder, when colleagues began to comment on corporate time spent on personal errands, Ricardo felt the fabric of his life tighten again. He had not anticipated that his small acts would be considered a deviation. He had not anticipated the moral clarity that required actual logistical planning. He also began to notice the tiny, joyous changes in the office. Someone brought in an extra bowl of lunch and said, "This tastes like my grandmother's recipe," and there was a hush of recognition. Another employee, typically curt, lingered at the cafeteria line to ask about Mateo, and then he volunteered one afternoon to help repair a crutch. The company's culture, once crisp and distant, loosened in small ways, a kindness here, a conversation there, that made the workspace feel less like a series of transactions and more like a neighborhood. Ricardo felt both flattered and ashamed by the attention. The attention was harmless, he told himself. It was better than indifference. Still, Marcelo's voice acted like a rational trip. Beware exceptions. Exceptions become rules. Rules are safer.
Ricardo sat alone one evening on the company's rooftop garden, looking out over the city silhouette. The lights blinked like small cities of their own, each one holding private economies. He thought about being a steward of resources. He thought about the temptation to become a spectacle. He thought about how Rosa refused to be grateful for the wrong reasons. He thought about Mateo, who had taught him something with a half-eaten fried pastry and a steady look. Generosity could be reciprocal. The boy had given him more than food. He had given him a way back into feeling. That night, Ricardo drafted a small list. It was an odd thing for a CEO's to-do list. Enroll Mateo in school. Arrange for Rosa to be considered for employment as a cook in the company cafeteria. Find a temporary room on campus to keep them warm on rainy nights. Meet with HR to figure out payroll and benefits if Rosa would work. He added notes about sensitivity, how to prevent their story from becoming a viral spectacle, how to ensure privacy, how to avoid the trap of making Rosa a symbol rather than a person. He did not yet know where he would find the courage to propose practical help in a corporation that measured risk like a heartbeat. He did not yet know whether Marcelo would see the human truth as a liability or a call to a different ledger. He only knew that each small action felt less like charity and more like a redefinition of what it meant to be in control. The next morning, he brought Rosa a clean apron and a letter in a professional envelope, not philanthropy, but a formal invitation to meet. He brought Mateo a brand new box of crayons. Mateo's eyes nearly popped out of his head. "New," he said with disbelief. He arranged the crayons in a perfect row, color by color, reverence visible in the way he held them. They accepted the meeting. Rosa took the letter into her hands as if it might be fragile. She examined the signature with an authenticity that asked for no fuss. "We do not want charity," she told Ricardo in the small office they had arranged to use for privacy, the saucepan of her words simmering with resolve. "We want work. We want to be able to cook and feed and send Mateo to school without your name attached to it like a badge." Ricardo said he understood. He meant it. He also felt in that moment the weird pressure of having to translate kindness into structures without making survivors feel like exhibits. The city's engines hummed beyond the viaduct. Inside that little space, a different kind of engine, a human one, was warming. When Ricardo left, the decision was not yet public, not yet implemented.
It sat between him and his partner's caution and the stubborn dignity of a woman who had fed a child without asking for anyone's permission. It hovered like an unmade choice, one that could tilt into real practical help or evaporate under the routine demands of a boardroom.
As he walked back toward the office, carrying a box of freshly laundered blankets, he felt the look of a passerby, curious, and the quiet ripple of faces in the company cafeteria that had started to watch him with new tenderness. He also felt the weight of a will he had not expected to architect, to create not a spectacle, but a home of small, steady transactions that meant a person could breathe easier. He slid into the elevator, the box of blankets balanced like a promise. On the 10th floor, Marcella was waiting, as if the universe enjoyed lining up obstacles in neat rows. Marcella's expression was a crossword puzzle, composed, skeptical, unsmiling. "You're doing this again?" Marcelo asked, finger tapping a pen. "Before we talk budgets, before we look at projections, Rico, you've got to be careful. This could spiral." Ricardo closed his eyes briefly and pictured Mateo's smile. He opened them and met Marcelo's pragmatic stare. "I know risk," he said. "This one feels worth it." Marcelo's jaw tightened. "Then make it worth it. Don't let it be a PR story. Don't let it crash our focus, and make sure you're ready for the paperwork." Ricardo swallowed. Paperwork. He had not imagined that the language of bureaucracy would be the pathway to dignity, but he knew it now. To give without structure was to risk creating what Rosa feared, a spectacle. To give with structure was to risk being entangled in someone else's measure of worth. He set the blankets down in his office and sat. Outside the window, the city rolled on, indifferent and intimate at once. Inside, his calendar waited, a bright, indifferent thing. He had to choose how to spend his energy, how much of himself to invest in a child who had the steady courage to hide a snack under a car, rather than let it be taken. The choice felt less like a sudden revelation and more like a tide. It had already begun to move. The tide that had begun to move did not break all at once. It moved in careful, public ways. Emails, meetings, signatures, small concessions that smelled of bleach and bureaucracy as much as they did of blankets and soup. Ricardo learned quickly that kindness with no paperwork was the kind of mercy that could collapse under the weight of other people's needs. So he set himself to work, the only way he knew, by turning intention into a plan that could be sustained. He called Silvana from his car on the way to the office, keeping his voice low as if the thing he was arranging were fragile. Silvana ran human resources, an exacting, quietly warm woman who had made a practice of translating corporate policy into human terms. When Ricardo explained, briefly, without the flourish his board often expected, she listened with the attentiveness of someone who read people the way others read spreadsheets. "We're not doing this as PR," he said. "I want it private, dignified. I want Rosa on payroll with a contract. I want a small room on campus for them while we figure out housing."
I want Mateo in school. I'll cover everything. I just need the company to do the right, practical things. Silvana kept the phone on mute for a heartbeat, then exhaled. "We can do that," she said. "But we have to be careful. Employment means payroll, taxes, background checks. Temporary housing means permits, safety, maintenance. School means paperwork and coordination with social services." Her voice made the list of requirements feel like a net, which could hold them if properly woven. "Do it," Ricardo said. The word was a simplification of months of unease. He handed the details to her and trusted the thread to someone who knew how to stitch. Silvana's response was practical and quietly fierce. She set up a meeting with legal and facilities maintenance. She asked for clear parameters. She pushed back on anything that might expose Rosa or Mateo to public attention without consent. She insisted on a transparent payroll arrangement. No envelopes, no hush money, no glossy social media posts. "If we do this," she said, "we do it right. We respect them." The first meeting with legal was small and businesslike. Contracts were drafted like bridges, an employment agreement with fair wage and defined hours, a probationary period that would protect both parties, a clause ensuring privacy. Facilities walked the campus and identified an unused staff room, a modest unit under the maintenance wing that could be cleaned, insulated, and furnished without disrupting operations.
It had a small window that faced an inner courtyard and a door that could be made private. Not a palace, but shelter that respected dignity. They scheduled a time to talk with Rosa. Ricardo felt unnerved in a way the boardroom had never made him. The clean lines of corporate life had hardened him into a man who negotiated sharply and expected compliance. Rosa was not someone who needed soft words or soft promises. She needed work, and she wanted it to be real. The first face-to-face was done quietly. Silvana arrived with a folder. Ricardo carried a small bundle of pens and a notebook, as if the physicality of things mattered. Rosa met them at the edge of the tarpaulin, where her life folded inward. She folded her arms and studied the papers like a woman eyeing strangers who might bring trouble. "We want you to work for us," Ricardo said, the words clumsy in her mouth. "We want you to be paid as a cook for our staff cafeteria, full-time, with benefits. The room we found can be yours while we set up longer-term housing. It's not charity, it's employment." Rosa's eyes narrowed in ways that were both weary and proud. "I do not want your pity," she said. "I will not be here to be looked at. I cook because I am a cook. I feed people. If you want that, you must pay me properly, not your promises, not your charity. Pay." Silvana placed the contract on a clipboard and slid it forward.
It listed wages equal to local standards, paid leave, and a clause that guaranteed privacy and a small severance in the unlikely case things ended abruptly. There were schedules that honored Rosa's need to be home in the evenings to watch Mateo, and a clause that allowed her to take Sundays for market errands or to help a neighbor. Rosa read it, finger tracing ink like a seamstress checking a hem. She did not sign immediately. She wanted to know how loud the company would be in telling others about them, how it would protect them from the curious and the photographers who sometimes circled like scavengers. When Silvana promised discretion, no press, no social media posts, Rosa allowed a small, incredulous smile to loosen. "Then I will do it," she said. Everything that followed felt strangely formal. Signatures that felt like vows, the first deposit into a new bank account set up in Rosa's name, the delivery of a small mattress and 2 skirts of new sheets. Silvana arranged for a municipal liaison to explain tax forms to Rosa and to help with a basic ID. The facilities team painted the little room a soft green and installed a curtain for privacy. An old office couch became a bed. A small table served as a counter where Rosa could set spices and a coffee tin. Ricardo bought a second-hand refrigerator and, with a humility that surprised himself, carried it across the courtyard and set it inside. At the company cafeteria the first day Rosa cooked, the smell threaded through the building like a new chord. She was deliberate and fast, an old rhythm finding new space. She stirred sauces with a motion that had the confidence of someone who had fed many hungry mouths. The employees lined up with curiosity before the food became a ritual. They returned later with lunches and told their colleagues, "You have to try Rosa's beans." Someone wrote a sticky note and taped it to the staff board. "Rosa's stew saved my Wednesday." The cafeteria's response mattered in a way Ricardo had not expected. Workplaces have their own weather, moods that lift or cloud depending on what kind of food people share, what kind of conversations happen across trays. Rosa's cooking was ordinary magic. People gathered in ways they had not before. Conversations that once barreled past each other began to swell and linger. The IT guy who was usually buried in code paused to ask Rosa for a recipe. Someone from finance slowed his walk and laughed with a junior associate about a childhood memory. The company, which had been a machine of efficient transactions, became a place where faces remembered each other's names. Not everyone applauded. Marcelo remained skeptical. He asked for metric reports, cost-benefit analyses, time away from work calculations, potential liabilities. He was not unkind. He was a man who believed that systems allowed good intentions to survive beyond single people's energies.
But he agreed to an experiment, a 3-month pilot with documented outcomes and clear privacy safeguards. Marcelo appeared at the cafeteria one afternoon as a kind of reluctant emissary. He had been called by Silvana to observe and to report. He ate Rosa's stew with the concentration of a man tasting something his spreadsheets could not capture. He kept his face neutral, but the corners of his mouth betrayed him. "This reminds me of my grandmother," he said, half to himself. He looked around and saw employees lingering more, a small team exchanging notes about a colleague's sick child, one person offering to pick up groceries for Rosa when she ran low. Marcelo dusted off a memory he had not known he'd kept. He left the cafeteria and later asked to see the payroll setup. He wanted to understand the mechanics. He did not, as Ricardo expected, overturn the arrangement. He began to help make it practical. The pilot required patience.
Bureaucracy intervened in small, predictable ways. A missed document, a misfiled form, the school that required proof of residence and a birth certificate. Ricardo learned to translate his impatience into persistence. He sat in municipal offices where air conditioning hummed and sunlight fell in narrow bands across linoleum floors. He filled out forms, produced letters of employment, asked a sympathetic clerk if Mateo's school attendance could be expedited given special circumstances. He met Miss Perez, the third-grade teacher at the neighborhood school, a woman with a kind but efficient manner who, when she saw Mateo's drawings, said, "We can start him with literacy support. We'll make room." The birth certificate issue was the thorniest. Mateo's paperwork was a tangle of small claims and unfiled moments. There were reports of births and visits to clinics that lacked records. For a while, it seemed like the system might block their progress. Ricardo, who had used other people's resources for a long time without personally navigating the parts of the city that handled the less glamorous work of living, sat in council with a social worker who believed in pragmatic fixes. They found a path: affidavits from relatives, a municipal registration that allowed provisional enrollment, and a promise from the school to accept Mateo while clearance was being verified. Mateo's first day of school was small and reverberant. He stood at the edge of the playground like someone about to step into new weather. His one leg made his balance a careful choreography. He hopped, he leaned into his crutch, he tested the small world like someone listening for music. Ricardo and Rosa walked with him to the gate and watched as Mateo's small hand loosened from Rosa's heavy, capable fingers to the teacher's gentler grasp. Inside the classroom, cardboard animals watched over a green carpet. Miss Perez placed a crayon in Mateo's hand and asked him to draw a bird.
He sketched with a confidence that surprised even himself, an arc for the wing, a triangle for the beak. The other children watched. One little girl, a freckle-faced boy with a rapid laugh, said, "Do you want to play tag after?" And Mateo hesitated only long enough to measure whether the world would accept his pace. He nodded, and they spent 10 minutes inventing new rules. Tag where you could hop, tag where you could only touch shoulders. The rules changed to fit him instead of making him be small. Ricardo's evenings became alternations between boardroom calls and bedtime reading. He taught Mateo the letters the way a man learns again to speak a language he had once only read about in white papers. They sat on the living room floor of the little staff room and spelled animal names aloud. Mateo wanted bird first, then boat, then red, his favorite color. He pronounced words with fierce concentration and then rewarded himself with a laugh that ricocheted around the small space like sunlight. The practical supports multiplied in small, human ways. A maintenance worker who fixed a leaky sink in the staff room also fashioned a leather strap for Mateo's crutch, learned from an old friend how to make it lighter. A neighbor donated a second-hand prosthetic leg that needed adjustment. A volunteer from a local clinic helped fit it so the stump would not be sore. The prosthetic was not a cure-all. Some days Mateo preferred his crutch, but it offered a new range of motion that made the playground more reachable. Rosa kept to her rules. She refused to be infantilized by gratitude. She insisted on a kitchen schedule that allowed her to walk a few blocks at dusk to hand out soup to neighbors in need. Not charity, she said, just feeding people. She cooked with the kind of skill that had learned to make thin ingredients sing. She guarded Mateo with a fierce tenderness that softened the edges of corporate responsibility, with the visceral knowledge of what made a family's day tolerable: a hot bowl, clean socks, someone who remembered birthdays. The office, in turn, learned to integrate the smallness into its very function. Meetings that had once been monocultures of agenda and outcome now carried a softness. An extra chair left empty because an employee went to pick up a child, a shared potluck to celebrate a colleague's recovery, a donation of time where engineers fixed a wobbling wheelchair ramp at a community center. The changes did not make the company perfect. It still had deadlines and quarterly goals, but the weather inside, colleagues pulling together, stepping in, shifted. Through it all, Marcelo altered his posture. He remained prudent and inquisitive, but he began to ask different questions. He asked Silvana about the cost trends and saw that the investment in dignity did not eat the bottom line. He met Rosa once at the staff table and asked, without his usual professional armor, for a recipe. She laughed and wrote down the measure of spices without caring about his title. He asked Ricardo, late one evening, whether there was anything else he could do to help. The words were not heavy with guilt. They were small and sincere. Yet not every transition was smooth. Munsen, a neighbor's teenage son, an older kid who once teased Mateo, pushed too hard on a game and Mateo fell awkwardly, skin scabbed, pride bruised.
Rosa, furious for a moment and then tender, escorted the boy's mother to the pot of stew and agreed on a system where the teens could learn kitchen tasks in exchange for respecting the playground. The neighborhood negotiated its own terms for peace. And there were moments of misunderstanding at work. A journalist once noticed a change in the cafeteria, and the rumor mill spun. A colleague, well-meaning but indiscreet, posted a grainy image of a plate online. It spread faster than anyone expected. Silvana acted decisively. She reminded the staff of their privacy agreement, took down the post, and spoke to the journalist who had reached out. She explained that this was not a spectacle and the company would not commodify people for likes. The journalist moved on. The larger city kept turning. The little triangle of Rosa, Mateo, and Ricardo stayed patient. The deeper payoff came not in accolades, but in small, private returns. One afternoon, Ricardo walked past the viaduct and found Mateo sitting on a low ledge with a few pieces of fashioning string and 2 small metal washers. The boy was making a toy, threading the washers onto the string until it chattered like shy teeth. Ricardo sat down and watched the concentration fold across Mateo's forehead. A man who had once measured minutes and margins now found himself learning to keep time, measured by patience. "Do you want to try?" Mateo asked, offering the string with a solemnity that made Ricardo's throat tighten. He took it and helped Mateo throughout the washers. It was a small, clumsy ritual that knitted them together in a way an investor pitch never had. The washers were soon transformed into a bracelet that Mateo looped around Ricardo's wrist, one he wore in board meetings as if it were a secret code. The months passed. The pilot period ended, and with it, the paperwork showed that the company could afford something small and humane without toppling balance sheets. The benefits were not only monetary. Employee retention in one department ticked up. Sick days decreased by a modest percentage as mutual aid knitted into the office culture. People came to work knowing their colleagues were also people. Marcelo presented the report to the board with a kind of dry humor that hid a surprise. He did not lionize the initiative. He enumerated facts. But the facts in that meeting were shaded with moments. An employee who reconnected with a sick father. A junior engineer who said the cafeteria food reminded him of Sunday afternoons with family.
Data and human stories at last held hands. Mateo learned his letters and then his words. He stumbled over spellings, and then found that reading aloud the names of birds and boats made his tongue loosen like a reel and spooling. Ricardo, imperfect at pedagogy but earnest, kept his promise. They added short walks to the plan, trips to the library where Mateo's eyes widened at row after row of books, the smell of paper and ink like another kind of sustenance. They checked out a book about a boy who built a boat. Mateo traced the boat's outline and later drew his own version with red hulls and blue sails. The reciprocal nature of the gift, how much Mateo and Rosa had given to Ricardo, grew more obvious with each passing small victory. He slept more easily. He brought home small, unimportant things for the boy, a pack of stickers, a cheap slingshot that broke after a day. He learned to make time with the awkwardness of a man relearning to be present. Rosa's stories about her mother's recipes taught him something about patience, the way a stock could be reduced low without losing flavor, how ingredients could be stretched with respect. It all felt like a pedagogy for living. The end that the story needed was not dramatic. It arrived like a small hand put into an adult's palm, gentle, deliberate, whole. One late morning, as Ricardo walked past the viaduct after a string of back-to-back meetings, he saw Mateo standing in the same spot where he had first found him, beside the SUV, beside a small assembly of children who were arguing over a skipping rope. Mateo held something cupped in his hands. Ricardo walked slower now. Mateo's face brightened without a rush. He had been saving whatever it was as if it were a secret for a very long time. When Ricardo came closer, Mateo extended his hands. Inside the small paper wrap lay a single fried pastry, warm and oddly perfect, the same kind of humble treat that had begun their first conversation. Beside it was a small scrap of paper with a drawing, a crude house, a steaming pot, and a stick figure wearing a bracelet. "For you," Mateo said. Ricardo's throat tightened. He crouched and accepted the pastry as if it were the last thing in the desert. "You made this?" he asked. Mateo shrugged. "Rosa taught me. She says you once shared her soup. I learned to make a tiny one for you. I wrapped it so it would not spill." They sat on the curb again. Not plainer men and children, but people kin to the same small humanity. Ricardo tasted the pastry and found again that it held more than flour and spice. It tasted of home, of work done with care. He realized with a quiet astonishment that he had expected to be the giver in the story's neat arc. Instead, the story had been reciprocal all along.
Mateo had saved him from a life that prioritized returns over presents. Rosa's steady engines of care had taught him to keep smaller promises. He looked at Mateo and saw a boy who had taught him how to be seen.
He looked at Rosa and saw a woman who refused to be turned into a symbol. He felt a solidity that had nothing to do with net worth. The ripple continued beyond them. Employees began a small fund, not to show off, but to help families in the neighborhood with urgent needs, an accidental kindness that made people feel connected. A volunteer group repaired the playground and installed rubber tiles so children could fall without fear. The school noticed upticks in attendance and made room for more small interventions. The library extended hours. A retired teacher volunteered afternoons to help kids with reading. The neighborhood's petty cruelties did not vanish, nor did the wider city's injustices. But the corner where a boy had once hidden a pastry under a car began to hum with a different civility. There were lessons that Ricardo carried into the rest of his life. Meetings no longer felt like the only place where meaning could be measured. He began carving out small windows of time that were not for networking, but for listening. He learned that dignity required structures, contracts, payroll, privacy, but that structures needed to be human-shaped, not box-shaped. He accepted that doing good required the same stubborn attention he had used for his startups: planning, accountability, follow-through. He accepted, too, that sometimes the most important returns were not financial at all. Months after that first pastry, Ricardo sat at his kitchen table, no longer in an apartment that looked exactly like success, and yet still tidy, and read a note Matthew had slipped under his door. It was a drawing, simple and unadorned. A sun, a pot, a smiling figure. At the bottom, in lopsided letters, Mateo had written, "For you, thank you." Ricardo folded the note and kept it in his wallet, a small talisman he would not brandish, but would carry. There was no epiphany that rewrote the city. There was instead a pattern of attention that persisted. Mateo's homework, Rosa's steady hand at the stove, Marcela's guarded but real support, Silvana's insistence on doing things with dignity. The story's moral was not an instruction delivered from on high, but a question posed gently, insistently, to anyone willing to notice. How many people do we pass without seeing? How many hidden snacks, small acts of generosity, or folded hands asking only for recognition slip by under the speed of our lives? There is no formula, no universal cure. There is, however, a simple practice: to stop long enough to share what we have: time, food, a wage, a listening ear, and to structure that sharing so it honors the person receiving it. If this story moved you, take a moment now, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to be reminded that generosity is often a two-way street. On a late afternoon, the three of them, Ricardo, Mateo, and Rosa, sat at a small table in the staff room, the light slicing across the room in long bars.
Rosa set a small plate in front of Ricardo, another pastry, slightly crisper than the last, made with hands that had learned to make everything into sustenance. Mateo watched Ricardo's face as if he wanted to see whether the man had changed as much as his life had. Ricardo smiled and, without ceremony, offered Mateo his half. They ate in a comfortable silence, the kind that belongs only to people who have learned to be present. The city hummed beyond the window like a chorus. The parking lot where Ricardo thought he might have caused harm was now a place where someone had been seen, a place that had become a hinge for change, small enough to be human and large enough to matter. Share in the comments a time when a small act of kindness changed the direction of your life.